Browns fans, for months, we've all been asking the same question. Why would a franchise willingly move on from a player who wasn't just its biggest star, but arguably the most important player to wear a Browns uniform in an entire generation? When the news first broke, most people assumed they already knew the answer. Some blamed money, others blamed the front office, and plenty of fans believed the organization had simply decided to start over. But now, new details emerging from inside the Browns' decision-making process suggest the story may be far more complicated than anyone realized. Because what we're learning now is that this wasn't just a trade. It wasn't simply a football decision. It may have been the moment Cleveland officially chose a completely different path for the future of the franchise, a path that could determine whether this team becomes a consistent contender for years to come, or spends the next decade wondering what could have been. And the most surprising part is that one specific detail reportedly changed everything behind closed doors. For a long time, it appeared impossible to imagine the Browns without Myles Garrett leading the defense. He was the face of the franchise, the player opposing offenses feared most, the superstar who gave Cleveland a chance every single Sunday, regardless of what else was happening around him. When things went wrong, Garrett was the player fans could still believe in. That's what makes the latest revelations so shocking, because according to reports, the draft picks weren't what truly grabbed Cleveland's attention. The Browns reportedly saw something else, something they believed could help define the next era of Browns football. And while that story alone is big enough to dominate headlines, it isn't even the most important development unfolding right now, because the consequences of this trade extend far beyond one player leaving and another arriving. Hidden beneath all the headlines is a much bigger shift that could impact every single decision this organization makes moving forward, from the coaching staff to the quarterback position, from player development to future draft strategy. The entire direction of the franchise may have changed overnight. What's happening right now in Cleveland feels less like a routine offseason and more like the beginning of a massive experiment. The Browns are betting that a younger foundation, a new coaching vision, and a completely different approach to team building can accomplish something the previous version of this franchise never could. Some fans are excited, others are furious, and many still aren't sure what to think. But one thing has become impossible to ignore. The Browns have officially entered a new chapter, and the stakes couldn't be any higher. Today, we're going to break down the behind-the-scenes reason this blockbuster decision finally happened, why Browns executives appear so confident in the player they acquired, and how this move may have dramatically changed the expectations surrounding first-year head coach Todd Monken. Because the more information that comes out, the clearer it becomes that Cleveland isn't just planning for next season, they're planning for something much bigger. And whether that vision turns out to be brilliant or disastrous may end up defining the future of the franchise for years to come. For a while, Browns fans were led to believe that the Myles Garrett situation came down to a simple calculation. A superstar wanted to compete for championships immediately, and Cleveland was willing to listen if another team offered enough draft capital. On the surface, that explanation made sense. After all, that's usually how these blockbuster NFL deals work. Teams collect future assets, stockpile draft picks, and begin planning for tomorrow. But as more details emerged from inside the organization, it became clear that Cleveland wasn't approaching this trade like most franchises would. In fact, reports indicate that multiple discussions took place long before any deal gained serious traction. Teams understood Garrett's value. General managers around the league knew that adding a player of his caliber could instantly transform a defense. Calls were made, interest was expressed, potential frameworks were explored. Yet despite all of that, the Browns remained hesitant. The offers may have included future picks and valuable assets, but none of them appeared to be enough to convince Andrew Berry in the front office to move one of the most dominant players in football. That hesitation tells us something important. Cleveland wasn't looking for a traditional rebuild package. They weren't simply trying to maximize the number of draft selections they could collect. If that had been the goal, the organization likely could have completed the deal much earlier. Instead, they kept waiting, they kept evaluating, and according to what we've learned, there was one specific piece they wanted that completely changed the conversation. That piece was Jared Verse. The moment Verse reportedly became part of the discussions, everything shifted. Suddenly, the trade wasn't just about giving up a superstar. It became about acquiring a player the Browns believed could become a cornerstone of their future. That's a huge distinction. Draft picks represent possibilities. They represent hopes and projections. Jared Verse represented something much more tangible. He was already proving himself at the NFL level. He was already showing signs of becoming one of the league's most dangerous young defenders. And perhaps most importantly, he fit perfectly into the timeline Cleveland appears to be building around. Think about it from the Browns' perspective. Losing Garrett meant losing the centerpiece of the defense. It meant losing the player opposing offensive coordinators spent entire weeks trying to neutralize. It meant losing leadership, production, and a level of game-changing talent that rarely comes around. Replacing that kind of impact through future draft picks alone would have been nearly impossible. The organization understood that reality. That's why Verse reportedly became such a critical factor in the negotiations. What's fascinating is that this reveals how the Browns truly view him. They don't appear to see him as compensation. They don't see him as a secondary piece included to make the numbers work. They appear to view him as a foundational building block, a player capable of helping bridge the gap between the previous era of Browns football and whatever comes next. That's an enormous vote of confidence for a player who still has much of his career ahead of him. And that's where the story becomes even more intriguing, because while fans naturally focused on what Cleveland was losing, the front office was reportedly focused on what they believed they were gaining. Internally, there seems to be genuine confidence that Verse has not yet reached his ceiling. At just 25 years old, he represents something every NFL team desperately wants but rarely finds: elite talent paired with youth. Those two things together are incredibly valuable in today's league. The Browns weren't just evaluating who Jared Verse is right now. They were evaluating who they believe he can become 3 years from now, 5 years from now, and potentially for the next decade. That's the kind of thinking that drives franchise-altering decisions. And whether fans agree with it or not, it helps explain why Cleveland was willing to make a move that once seemed completely unthinkable. But while Jared Verse may have been the key that unlocked the trade, the Browns' confidence in him raises an even bigger question. What exactly do they see in this young pass rusher that makes them believe he can help lead the next chapter of Browns football? Because the answer reveals just how ambitious this organization's vision really is. The more you examine this trade, the more one reality becomes impossible to ignore. The Browns did not agree to move Myles Garrett because they believed Jared Verse could simply fill a roster spot. They agreed to it because they believe he has the potential to become one of the defining players of their next era. That's a massive statement when you consider the player he's effectively being asked to follow. Let's be honest about something. Replacing Myles Garrett is impossible. There is no realistic scenario where a young defender walks into Cleveland and immediately reproduces what Garrett accomplished over nearly a decade. We're talking about one of the most dominant pass rushers the NFL has ever seen, a player who routinely changed games by himself. Offensive coordinators built entire game plans around slowing him down. Quarterbacks lost sleep preparing for him. Those kinds of players don't come around often. That's exactly why the Browns weren't searching for another Myles Garrett. They were searching for the next foundational star. And according to everything we're hearing from inside the organization, they believe Verse has the tools to become that player. What makes Verse so appealing isn't just his production, it's the combination of age, athleticism, versatility, and trajectory. Front offices across the NFL are obsessed with one question when evaluating talent: is this player still improving? In Verse's case, the answer appears to be a clear yes. Every season has brought growth. Every year has added another layer to his game. And perhaps most importantly, he's already producing at a level many veterans spend entire careers trying to reach. That's why Browns executives reportedly view him differently than a typical trade asset. They're not focused solely on what he has accomplished, they're focused on what he could become. When organizations make franchise-altering decisions, they often bet on projection as much as production. Cleveland appears convinced that Verse's best football is still ahead of him. And if they're right, the impact of this trade could look very different a few years from now than it does today. Another factor that stands out is his maturity. One concern teams often have when acquiring young talent is whether that player can handle becoming a centerpiece of a franchise. Talent alone isn't enough. Expectations increase, pressure increases. Every performance gets scrutinized, every mistake gets magnified, the spotlight becomes relentless. Yet everything about Verse's progression suggests he's embraced bigger responsibilities throughout his football journey, rather than shrinking from them. That confidence is likely one reason Andrew Berry appeared so comfortable discussing Verse's future potential. Notice what the Browns didn't do. They didn't publicly lower expectations. They didn't describe him as a developmental project. They didn't frame him as someone who might eventually contribute. Instead, the messaging coming out of the organization suggests they believe he can make an impact immediately while continuing to develop into something even greater. And that's where things become fascinating for Browns fans. Because if the front office is correct, Cleveland may have acquired something far more valuable than a collection of future draft selections. They may have secured a player who can anchor the defense for the next decade. Someone who can grow alongside the younger core of the roster and help establish the identity of this team moving forward. Of course, not everyone is convinced. There are plenty of fans who believe comparing anyone to the impact Garrett had in Cleveland is unfair, and honestly, that's a reasonable argument. Garrett earned his place among the greatest players in franchise history through years of elite production. Verse hasn't done that yet. He still has to prove himself. He still has to handle the pressure. He still has to demonstrate that he can thrive as one of the faces of a franchise, rather than simply being a talented young player. But here's the important distinction. The Browns aren't betting that Jared Verse will become Myles Garrett. They're betting that Jared Verse can become Jared Verse, their own version of a franchise cornerstone, their own defensive superstar, their own player that future teams will be built around. That's a much more realistic expectation, and it's likely the reason they were willing to make such a bold decision. What's even more interesting is what this reveals about how the Browns view the future, because if they truly believe Verse is a foundational piece, then this trade wasn't about taking a step backward. It was about accelerating a larger plan that has likely been developing behind the scenes for quite some time. A plan that extends far beyond one player and reaches into every corner of the organization. And once you understand that, another realization starts to emerge. The Myles Garrett trade may never have been about replacing one superstar with another. It may have been the first major move in a complete shift of philosophy, one that could change how the Browns build their roster for years to come. While most of the football world was focused on the headline itself, something much bigger was unfolding behind the scenes. In fact, there's a strong argument that many Browns fans have been looking at this trade completely the wrong way, because the real story may not be about Myles Garrett leaving. The real story may be about a philosophical shift that started long before the trade was ever announced. For years, Cleveland operated under a very specific reality. As long as Myles Garrett was on the roster and performing at an elite level, the organization felt pressure to maximize every season. Every offseason move, every free agent signing, every coaching decision, and every roster adjustment carried the same underlying message: win now. When you have a generational player in his prime, patience becomes difficult. The clock is always ticking. Every season that doesn't result in a deep playoff run feels like a missed opportunity. That's what made the Garrett era both exciting and complicated. On one hand, the Browns always had one of the most dangerous defensive weapons in football. On the other hand, that reality created enormous pressure throughout the organization. There was little room for long-term thinking. There was little room for mistakes. The focus remained fixed on immediate results, because that's what happens when a franchise believes its championship window is already open. But what many fans didn't realize is that Cleveland may have quietly reached a crossroads. The front office was staring at a roster that still had unanswered questions. The quarterback position remained uncertain, several young players were still developing, new coaches were arriving.
The team was entering a transition period, whether people wanted to admit it or not, and rather than continuing to push all of their chips towards short-term success, the Browns appear to have made a calculated decision to reposition the entire franchise timeline. That's why the draft picks included in this deal matter so much. Casual observers often hear about future selections and immediately think rebuilding, but that doesn't necessarily seem to be what the Browns are doing here. Instead, they appear to be creating flexibility. Those picks represent opportunities to move up in future drafts, opportunities to address major roster needs, opportunities to acquire players who can become part of the next core group of players. Most importantly, they give the organization options at a time when uncertainty still exists at some of the most important positions on the roster.
Think about it this way. Before the trade, the Browns were trying to balance two very different goals at the same time. They wanted to compete immediately while also preparing for the future. That's an incredibly difficult challenge in today's NFL. Eventually, most franchises are forced to choose a direction, continue chasing short-term results, or invest more heavily in long-term sustainability. The Garrett trade suggests Cleveland has made that choice. That doesn't mean they're intentionally losing games. It doesn't mean they're waving a white flag on upcoming seasons. What it means is that the organization appears more interested in building something sustainable rather than chasing one final run built around a single superstar. That's a subtle difference, but it's a massive one when it comes to how teams operate. The evidence is everywhere once you start looking for it. The Browns acquired a young player they believe can become a cornerstone. They added valuable draft capital. They brought in a first-time head coach. They created room for younger players to earn larger roles. None of those moves individually tell the full story, but together they paint a very clear picture of where this franchise believes it is heading. And whether fans agree with that vision or not, there's no denying the boldness of it. Most organizations cling to familiar formulas for as long as possible. Cleveland chose something different. They chose uncertainty. They chose development. They chose a longer horizon. That takes conviction, because it also opens the door to criticism if things don't work out. The fascinating part is that this shift may end up impacting far more than the roster itself. In many ways, the person who benefits most from this new direction might not be Jared Verse at all. It might be the man standing on the sideline. Because while fans have spent weeks debating the Garrett trade, another enormous change has quietly taken place, and it could dramatically alter how Todd Monken's first season as head coach is judged from the very beginning. If there is one person inside the Browns organization whose professional life may have changed the most because of the Garrett trade, it might be Todd Monken, and the reason has very little to do with X's and O's, offensive schemes, or play calling. Instead, it has everything to do with something that most first-time NFL head coaches never receive: time. In today's NFL, patience is almost extinct. Owners want results, fans want results, front offices want results. The moment a new head coach walks through the door, the countdown begins. Every loss gets analyzed, every mistake gets magnified, every press conference becomes a headline. That's especially true when a team believes it has championship-caliber talent already in place. Before the Garrett trade, Monkin was stepping into a situation where expectations could have become overwhelming almost immediately. Even if nobody publicly said Super Bowl or bust, there was still an understanding that the Browns possessed one of the league's most dominant defensive players and were expected to compete. When a roster includes a superstar of Garrett's caliber, the pressure naturally increases. Fans don't want to hear about long-term plans. They want wins, they want playoff appearances, they want proof that the organization is maximizing every remaining year of elite talent. That reality can be brutal for a new head coach.
Many coaches never get the opportunity to truly build a program because they're constantly trying to satisfy short-term expectations. Instead of developing young players, they're focused on surviving each week. Instead of experimenting with systems, they're trying to avoid criticism. Instead of thinking about where the roster could be in 3 years, they're worrying about the next press conference after a tough loss. But the moment Cleveland committed to a different direction, something remarkable happened. The expectations surrounding Todd Monken changed almost overnight. Suddenly, the conversation isn't entirely about wins and losses anymore. It's about development, it's about culture, it's about establishing an identity. Those may sound like simple buzzwords, but inside NFL buildings, they matter tremendously. Coaches often talk about building a foundation before building a contender. The challenge is that many organizations never give them enough time to complete the process. Monkin may now have that opportunity. For the first time, Browns fans are being encouraged to evaluate progress differently. Instead of obsessing over the final record, many will be watching for signs of growth. Is the offense becoming more disciplined? Are young players improving? Does the team look more organized? Are the coaching philosophies starting to take shape? Those questions suddenly matter just as much as the standings, and that's a powerful advantage for a first-year head coach. Because, let's face reality, the Browns still have major questions to answer. The quarterback situation remains one of the biggest storylines in the entire organization. Several younger players are expected to take on larger responsibilities. New systems are being installed on both sides of the football. There will almost certainly be mistakes along the way. There will be frustrating moments. There will be growing pains.
The difference is that those growing pains may now be viewed as part of the process rather than evidence of failure. That's a luxury very few first-time head coaches ever receive. In many ways, Monkin is stepping into a rare situation where he can focus on building rather than simply surviving. He can evaluate talent honestly. He can identify which players fit the long-term vision and which players don't. He can make decisions based on future success instead of immediate public reaction. That kind of flexibility can dramatically accelerate a coach's ability to shape a roster in his image. There's another layer to this that shouldn't be overlooked. Without Garrett dominating every headline, attention naturally shifts toward the coaching staff. For years, much of the Browns' identity revolved around having one of the NFL's most feared defenders. Now, the franchise must establish a new identity altogether. That responsibility falls heavily on Monkin and his staff. The culture, the style of play, the attitude of the team, all of it will increasingly reflect the coaches rather than a single superstar player. That's both exciting and dangerous. If the Browns show meaningful growth, Monkin will receive enormous credit for helping guide the transition. But if the team struggles to establish a clear direction, criticism will arrive quickly. The trade may have reduced immediate pressure, but it also increased the importance of long-term results. The organization is effectively trusting Monkin to help build the next version of Browns football from the ground up. And that brings us to the biggest challenge of all. Because while coaching philosophies and culture matter, every plan in the NFL eventually runs into the same unavoidable question. It's the question that has haunted franchises for decades. It's the question that determines championships, coaching careers, and front office legacies. Who is going to be the quarterback? And after everything that has happened in Cleveland, that question may now be more important than ever before. For all the attention surrounding Myles Garrett, Jared Verse, and Todd Monken, there is one reality Browns fans simply cannot escape. No matter how strong the defense becomes, no matter how promising the young talent looks, and no matter how many draft picks the organization accumulates, the future of this franchise will ultimately be determined by one position: quarterback. And if we're being honest, the Garrett trade may have made that reality even more obvious. For years, Cleveland had a unique luxury. Whenever uncertainty surrounded the offense, the defense could still provide stability because Myles Garrett was capable of changing games on his own. He could create turnovers, force mistakes, and completely disrupt opposing offenses. Even when the quarterback situation wasn't perfect, Garrett gave the Browns a chance to remain competitive. He was the ultimate equalizer. Now that safety net is gone. That doesn't mean the defense won't be good, it doesn't mean Jared Verse can't become a star, but it does mean the spotlight is shifting. The franchise can no longer rely on a single defensive superstar to carry the conversation. Attention is naturally moving toward the position that matters most in today's NFL. And that's where things get interesting. The Browns have clearly created more flexibility for themselves moving forward. The additional draft capital acquired through this trade gives the front office options, lots of options. They can use those assets to strengthen the roster. They can package picks in future trades. They can maneuver around the draft board if a quarterback prospect catches their attention. The point isn't that Cleveland has already identified its future quarterback. The point is that they now possess greater freedom to pursue one if they choose. That's a critical distinction, because one thing the Browns appear to understand is that finding the right quarterback changes everything. It changes timelines, it changes expectations, it changes the entire trajectory of an organization. We see it happen throughout the league every year. Teams spend decades searching for stability at the position, because once they find it, everything else becomes easier. And right now, Cleveland is still searching for answers. That's why the next year or two could become some of the most important seasons in recent franchise history. Every practice, every game, and every personnel decision will be evaluated through the lens of one simple question: does this move bring the Browns closer to finding their long-term answer at quarterback? It's a question that will influence almost every major decision Andrew Berry and Todd Monken make. The fascinating part is that this trade may have quietly aligned the organization's timeline with that search. Instead of feeling pressure to maximize every remaining season of Myles Garrett's prime, the Browns can now focus more aggressively on building the roster around a future signal caller whenever that player emerges. Whether that answer is already in the building or arrives through a future draft remains to be seen. What matters is that Cleveland now possesses the flexibility to adapt. Naturally, this has led to plenty of speculation among fans.
Some believe the extra draft picks are already part of a larger, long-term quarterback strategy. Others think the organization is simply accumulating assets and waiting for the right opportunity. At this stage, much of that remains speculation. There has been no official confirmation that a specific quarterback target exists. But what cannot be denied is that future draft capital gives the Browns significantly more control over their destiny than they had before. And in today's NFL, control is everything. The teams that consistently compete for championships are usually the teams that have a plan at quarterback. Sometimes that plan succeeds, sometimes it fails, but having options is far better than being trapped without them. The Browns appear determined to ensure they never find themselves in that situation again. What's particularly intriguing is how this could impact Todd Monken's approach as well. For the first time, he has the opportunity to help shape the development of a quarterback room without being consumed by immediate championship expectations. He can evaluate talent, he can identify strengths and weaknesses, he can determine what type of quarterback best fits the offensive identity he wants to build. Those evaluations could end up influencing the franchise for years. And that's why the quarterback conversation has suddenly become impossible to ignore. Because while fans continue debating whether trading Myles Garrett was the right decision, the organization may already be focused on a much bigger objective: the next franchise quarterback, the next face of the team, the next player capable of leading Cleveland into a sustained period of contention. The problem is that not everyone sees this vision the same way. In fact, the reaction from Browns fans has become one of the most fascinating parts of this entire story. Some believe the organization is finally thinking long-term. Others believe they just traded away the heart and soul of the franchise. And that divide may be larger than anyone expected. If Andrew Berry was hoping this trade would unite the fan base behind a single vision for the future, that certainly hasn't happened. In fact, the reaction across Browns Nation may be more divided than at any point in recent years, and honestly, it's not hard to understand why. On one side, there are fans who believe this was the type of difficult decisions successful organizations eventually have to make. They argue that football is ultimately about the future, not the past. As painful as it may be to move on from a franchise icon, they see the acquisition of Jared Verse, combined with multiple premium draft picks, as an opportunity to build something stronger over the long term. To them, this wasn't surrender, it was strategy. These fans point to the reality of the modern NFL. Rosters age quickly, championship windows can close overnight. Teams that refuse to evolve often find themselves stuck in the middle, not good enough to compete for titles and not bad enough to acquire elite young talent. From their perspective, Cleveland identified where the roster stood, accepted the situation, and made a proactive decision rather than waiting until circumstances forced their hand. Many of them also believe that timing matters. They look at the current roster and see a team with legitimate questions still needing answers. They see uncertainty at quarterback. They see a coaching staff entering its first season together. They see young players who need time to develop. In their eyes, maximizing Myles Garrett's remaining prime would have required the Browns to be much closer to championship contention than they currently appear to be. So, rather than delaying the inevitable, they believe the organization chose to get ahead of the problem. But then, there's the other side of the argument, and that side is just as passionate. For many Browns fans, this trade has nothing to do with draft capital, timelines, or long-term planning. To them, it's about losing the player who represented everything the franchise was trying to become. Myles Garrett wasn't simply a great defender, he was the face of the Browns. He was the player fans proudly wore on their jerseys. He was the superstar who remained elite regardless of what was happening around him. Through coaching changes, roster changes, and organizational turbulence, Garrett remained the constant. That's why some fans simply cannot accept the move. In their minds, when you have a player of that caliber, you find a way to make it work. You don't trade him, you build around him, you push harder, you take bigger swings, you do everything possible to maximize the years you have left with a future Hall of Fame talent. The idea of voluntarily moving on from someone like that feels completely backwards to them. What's interesting is neither side is necessarily wrong. That's what makes this debate so emotional. The supporters of the trade can point to logic, roster construction, and future flexibility. The critics can point to Garrett's production, leadership, and irreplaceable value. Both arguments contain legitimate truths. That's why conversations among Browns fans have become so heated. Everyone is looking at the same move, but seeing completely different things. Some see opportunity, others see risk. Some see a calculated investment in the future. Others see the loss of a franchise cornerstone. And because the outcome won't be known for years, neither group can claim victory right now.
That's another reason this debate isn't going away anytime soon. Every Jared Verse performance will be scrutinized. Every Browns victory will be analyzed. Every future draft selection acquired through this trade will be evaluated. Fans will be keeping score for years because this isn't the type of decision that gets judged after one season. It's a decision that shapes an entire era. Perhaps the most fascinating part of all this is how much responsibility now falls on the people making these decisions. Before, Myles Garrett's greatness often spoke for itself. Now, Andrew Berry and Todd Monken are asking fans to trust a vision that hasn't fully revealed itself yet. They're asking people to believe in a future that still exists mostly on paper. That's a difficult sell in any city. It's especially difficult in Cleveland, where fans have lived through enough disappointment to be skeptical of promises. Which brings us to the biggest question of all, because whether fans love this trade or hate it, whether they believe in the front office or remain deeply skeptical, one reality remains unchanged. Everything now comes down to whether Andrew Berry's gamble actually works. And if it doesn't, this move won't simply be remembered as a controversial, it could end up defining his entire legacy. At the end of the day, all the debates, all the speculation, and all the arguments surrounding this trade eventually lead back to one person, Andrew Berry, because whether Browns fans realize it or not, this wasn't just a roster move. It wasn't simply a trade involving a superstar player. It was a declaration, a statement about how Andrew Berry sees the future of the Cleveland Browns and what he believes is necessary to build a sustainable winner. And that's exactly why the consequences of this decision will follow him for the rest of his tenure. General managers are often remembered for one defining move. Sometimes it's a draft pick, sometimes it's a coaching hire, sometimes it's a trade that changes the direction of an entire franchise. For Andrew Berry, there is a very real chance that moving on from Myles Garrett becomes that defining decision. Think about the magnitude of what happened. Berry didn't trade a declining veteran nearing retirement. He didn't move a player who was struggling to produce. He traded one of the most dominant defenders in football, a player many fans viewed as untouchable, a player who represented excellence during some of the franchise's most uncertain years. Decisions like that don't get forgotten. That's why the pressure attached to this move is enormous, because now every piece of the return package matters. Every Jared Verse sack will be compared to what Garrett is doing elsewhere. Every future draft pick acquired through the trade will be examined under a microscope. Every success will be celebrated as evidence that Berry had a plan. Every failure will be used as proof that he made a catastrophic mistake. There is no middle ground anymore. That's what makes this such a fascinating gamble. If Jared Verse develops into one of the league's premier pass rushers, the narrative changes dramatically. Suddenly, the conversation becomes less about what Cleveland lost and more about what Cleveland gained. Fans begin to see the trade as a bold move that positioned the organization for long-term success. The draft picks become additional building blocks, the younger roster begins to make sense, and Andrew Berry starts receiving credit for having the courage to make a difficult decision before circumstances forced his hand. But the opposite scenario is equally possible. If Jared Verse fails to become the cornerstone player the Browns believe he can be, criticism will arrive quickly. If the future draft picks don't produce impact players, the scrutiny will intensify. If Cleveland struggles while Garrett continues dominating elsewhere, the trade will become impossible to escape. Every disappointing season will reopen old wounds. Every highlight from Garrett's career will serve as a reminder of what the franchise gave up. That's the reality of franchise-defining decisions. They create very little room for error. What's particularly interesting is that Berry appears fully aware of the risk. Nothing about this move feels accidental. It feels calculated. It feels deliberate. It feels like the decision of an executive who evaluated the current state of the roster, accepted where the team stood, and decided that a difficult short-term sacrifice offered the best chance for long-term success. Whether that evaluation proves correct remains unknown, and that's where things become even more intriguing. Because the success of this trade isn't solely tied to Jared Verse, it's tied to everything that happens next. It's tied to Todd Monken's ability to establish a winning culture. It's tied to player development. It's tied to future draft selections. It's tied to solving the quarterback position. In many ways, this trade isn't a standalone decision at all. It's the first domino in a chain of events that could shape the Browns for the next decade.
That's why this moment feels so significant. The organization has effectively chosen a path. They've chosen youth over certainty. They've chosen flexibility over familiarity. They've chosen potential over comfort. And now they have to prove that choice was the right one. The next 2 or 3 seasons may end up telling the entire story. By then, Browns fans will know much more about Jared Verse. They'll know more about Todd Monken. They'll know whether the draft assets were maximized. They'll know whether the organization found its quarterback of the future. Most importantly, they'll know whether Andrew Berry's vision actually worked. Until then, everything remains a projection. Everything remains a bet. And that's what makes this such a high-stakes moment in franchise history. Because years from now, when Browns fans look back on this era, they may point to this trade as the moment everything changed. The moment the organization either positioned itself for sustained success or made one of the most controversial mistakes in modern franchise history. Either way, Andrew Berry has attached his legacy to this decision. Now, all that's left is to find out whether that gamble pays off. So when we step back and look at the bigger picture, one thing becomes crystal clear. The Cleveland Browns didn't just trade Myles Garrett, they closed the door on one chapter of franchise history and opened another.
Whether that new chapter ultimately becomes a story of vision and success or a story of regret and missed opportunities is something nobody can answer today. What we do know is that the organization has made its choice. Andrew Berry has made his choice. Todd Monken has inherited that choice, and Browns fans are now along for the ride. The front office believes Jared Verse can become one of the foundational players of this franchise. They believe the additional draft capital gives them the flexibility to build something stronger and more sustainable. They believe this younger roster can grow together, and perhaps most importantly, they believe the future of the Browns is brighter with a long-term plan than with a short-term push built around a single superstar. That's a bold bet. It's also one of the riskiest bets this organization has made in years, because Myles Garrett wasn't just another great player, he was the player, the face of the franchise, the cornerstone, the constant source of confidence during seasons filled with uncertainty. Players like that don't come around often, and organizations rarely move on from them voluntarily. That's why this decision feels so different. That's why emotions remain so strong, and that's why the debate remains so strong. The truth is, the verdict on this trade won't come this season. It may not even come next season. The real answer will take years to reveal itself. We'll have to see what Jared Verse becomes. We'll have to see how Todd Monken shapes this team. We'll have to see whether the Browns can finally solve the quarterback position. And we'll have to see what those future draft picks eventually turn into. Only then will we know whether this was a masterstroke or a massive mistake. But that's exactly what makes this period so fascinating. For the first time in a long time, nobody truly knows where this franchise is headed. There are more questions than answers, more possibilities than certainties, more risk than comfort. Yet sometimes the most important moments in sports happen when organizations are willing to embrace uncertainty and bet on a vision that others can't yet see. That's what the Browns are doing right now. They're betting on youth. They're betting on development. They're betting on patience. They're betting on a future they believe will be stronger than the present they left behind. And whether Browns fans love that strategy or hate it, one thing is undeniable. The next few years are going to define this franchise. They're going to define Andrew Berry. They're going to define Todd Monken. They're going to define Jared Verse, and they may ultimately define the entire future of Cleveland football. Now, I want to hear from you. If you're sitting in Andrew Berry's chair, do you make this trade? Do you believe moving on from Myles Garrett was the right decision for the future of the franchise? Or do you think the Browns gave up a player they never should have let go? Let me know in the comments below, because this is one of the biggest debates Browns fans have had in years, and there's a strong argument on both sides. If you enjoyed today's breakdown, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another Browns update. We've got a lot more major stories coming, and if this offseason has taught us anything, it's that the future of the Cleveland Browns may be changing faster than any of us expected. Thanks for watching, and as always, go Browns!